So we would say, oh, we don't want to do maths, we want to write stories. And we all loved writing stories. I think there were 6 of us in the school. And so I had lots of experience as a kid of just writing. And then when I was doing my law degree, I would write poetry during lectures because the lectures were so boring. So I was somebody who probably shouldn't have gone down the legal path, but for many reasons I thought that that was my way to go. So once I'd spent 10 years as a lawyer, I thought, no, it's time to do what I really, really want to do, and that is to see if I can actually write some books. So I started the first Kalika Magic book, which is Emerald Child, and I wrote that for probably 3 years and couldn't let go of it and redrafted it over and over again. And then sent it off to Penguin Random House, and they responded to my query the same day. And I thought, oh, this is amazing, I'm going to be famous. So while they held onto my book and I sent them messages saying, oh, when's it going to be published, I kept writing. And so I wrote the second book, and then I started on the third book. And 2 years later, I was still sending messages to Penguin Random House, and they were still saying, oh no, it's definitely happening. So finally we got to a point where I sent the next manuscript off, and then they said to me, well, actually, we've had a meeting with our marketing team, and we're not sure where we're going to place your book. It's a bit mystical, it's a bit earthy. Can you maybe change a few things? But there was still no guarantee they were going to publish it. I think that they call it in the industry the slow no. So at that point I was completely disillusioned, shattered. Oh my God, I've written 3 books now and they're never going to get anywhere. And then I went on a trip to America and I met an author in Denver, and he was a self-published author. And he was quite well known, and he had published all these middle grade books himself. And he said, you have to look at this company called Ingram Spark. And I went, okay. And I never thought about self-publishing. I thought, oh, why would you do that? That's the most embarrassing thing ever. No credibility. But after I spoke to him, I thought, no, actually this could be an option. So I went down that track and haven't looked back. And it's been the most fantastic journey.
Fantastic. Let's talk about creating worlds. And this is one of the beautiful things about fiction. We actually breathe life into worlds that do not exist until we decide to start putting characters side by side, and it creates worlds, and then the words create worlds. What's it like when you're sitting down to create and sculpt a world from nothing?
Well, one of my great joys is when I'm sitting there with a blank piece of paper, because it becomes this amazing opportunity to just dive in and find out what's going to happen. So you're probably familiar with the term plotters and pantsers. You've got the plotters who will carefully plan their worlds, build their worlds, and plan the story out. Or you have the people who start with a blank sheet of paper and just start writing and see where it takes them. I fall into that latter category. I just love discovering it as I go. But having said that, it's also true that it's good to have a basis of writing what you know. So I like to start with a setting. So for example, with the Witches of the Crossworlds, the place where it all starts from is based on a spot where I used to go camping in the Blue Mountains as a kid, and the homestead is transporting Tokau Homestead to being just near the Jelly Bean Pool, and it's sort of combining a few different locations that I know very well and intimately together, and that gives you something that you can grab hold of when you start writing the story, and then you can just let your imagination go. So when it goes into the different worlds and when the magic starts happening, I really just let it be, find out what's going to happen and go with what my imagination throws at me.
I do something similar. I've actually never plotted my books particularly well because I try to plot them and then they go off on totally different tangents. I started the first book thinking of Narnia stories and very nostalgic and had a very specific way the story was going. By the time I got to the second book, I had thrown all of that out. I still had the fantasy forests and all the rest of it, but I was up in the mountains, there were shamanic themes and journeys with power animals and all of this stuff I had no idea about. But I was basically basing it, I guess, I had trekked in the Nepalese Himalayas, so I had an idea of adventuring in the mountains, and that was the basis. But when the story took off into other areas, that was just a result of writing so much, I think. And then by the time I got to the third book, I was Googling the places that were in my head because I didn't know what they were. They were just, it just has a life of its own, I think, creativity, when you get into it. Just takes off.
Can you talk more about that when you get into the zone of writing and what happens in your head, and do you know when you're in the zone, or does it just...
Oh, you know, it's such a buzz. You do know when you're in the zone. It's quite a trip. I think because a lot of the time you spend as a writer, you're just tearing your hair out. Do you find this, Graham? You're just going, oh, this is so hard.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting is that thing of getting into the zone, for me, is more likely to happen when I'm really, really tired than when I'm sitting down feeling fresh.
Oh, really?
And I think it's probably because when I'm tired, the barrier falls down, so it becomes more like a direct link to your imagination. So,
I think the best experience I had was I had to write a short story for a competition I entered once. And I had a bit of an idea in my head what it was going to be, and I drove all the way up to my parents' place, which was 2 hours away. And while I was driving, I was getting all these ideas, more ideas, more ideas. And when I got to my parents' place, I went and hid away and I sat in my grandmother's old chair. I don't know what was happening, but I just had this fully formed story, and I couldn't write fast enough. I was just... And I came out at the end going, oh, where did that come from? So when that happens, that's magic. That's
yes.
when you want to be a writer.
And that's something that I can very much relate to as well, because when you do get into the zone, it very easily ends up being 3 o'clock in the morning by the time you walk away from it, because you're madly going, where is this going? Where is this going? And what happens for me is the characters really start to drive the story. So I feel like I'm observing as the characters are just taking it over. And it's almost like being an observer, and as though you're writing a travelogue and you're madly trying to write it down while it's all happening and unfolding in front of you, and you're going, oh, what? She did that? And then he did that? And you go, but I like this character. And so often when I get into the zone, I'll have these situations happen where someone who was a hero suddenly turns out to be the villain. And I didn't know that. So if you have that surprise as a writer, you can be guaranteed that when people read it, they're going to get the same sort of response. And every time that's happened for me, I've got feedback from people where they've just been amazed, saying, how dare you do that to that character? I like them.
Yeah, don't hurt them.
Yeah.
Like that person.
Don't kill off the character.
Is that on that, when you're writing characters, they're your babies, they're your creations, but you do have to hurt them, right? You've got to put them through hell
You do,
and
and you have to
drama.
put them through worse and worse and worse situations. I run writing workshops with kids, and the most fun we have is when we put them through worse. We make up these fantastic characters, and then I tell them, right, make something really bad happen to your character. And at first they're going, oh, but I love my character. But then they go, oh, we'll make this, and then this, and then. And I wrote a story with a kid once who had his mother throwing the character off the top of a building and then throwing a fridge after the character. And it was just getting very gory and
It's wonderful.
but it's quite fun.
What about your writing rituals? When it comes time to write, do you have X words a day you aim for, or hours, or certain points during the day you like to write?
Well, when I'm not directing a writers' festival, I try and just make sure that I write for at least half an hour every day, and it doesn't matter how many words I write, as long as it's at least half an hour. And what that will usually be is just before I crash out, I'll decide, okay, time to do some writing, I'll have a glass of wine with me and just let the imagination flow. And if I get into the zone, I'll end up continuing for a few hours, but if I don't get into the zone, then I've still done something. And I think it's really important to do the thing of whether you feel like doing it or not, make the start, because it's amazing how often you start with yourself not feeling like you're in the mood to write, but then all of a sudden the character does something you didn't expect them to do, and you want to find out what happens next. And that's when you'll spill out a couple of chapters in really quick succession, because you just want to know what happens.
I think the most helpful thing anyone told me was when I was said, when you wake up in the morning, do 3 pages and call it, it's the morning pages. And I know it's come from a book called The Artist's Way. I don't know if you've seen that. But it's quite useful. It's set up as a 6-week course to rediscover your creativity. And one of the things she says in it is get up in the morning, do your 3 pages, and it doesn't matter what you write. And the idea is to clear out all the guff. So you just write anything, you never read it again, you never show it to anybody, you just scribble. And I would find if I did that, I was then ready to go and actually write something that might be worth reading. So get rid of all the nonsense in your head and see what happens afterwards. And it also gets you into the flow too, because I often find the first few pages when you sit down to write are very stilted and it's not going to go anywhere.
It's like going to the gym first thing in the morning. Is it persistence too? Do you have to do it every day? You've got to make it a habit.
I think it gets easier when you make it a habit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just taps into that flow.
Let's go back to our world. When you're creating worlds, do you set up laws, maps?
I'm a bit allergic to laws.
Yeah. Governance, magic, currencies, all these things.
My tendency is to build the world as I need it to be built, and I've always got a pretty clear idea in my head of what rules that world are. I've always really enjoyed learning about physics and so forth, so the magic systems that I use in the Witches of the Crossworlds is very much based on a fundamental sort of understanding of physics and trying to make sure that it's something that feels tangible. So it always links back to what I have in my head as being the limitations of the magic and how it works. So in the Witches of the Crossworlds, for example, the power comes from the multiverse. So being able to draw energy from another universe, but not being able to know where it comes from. So being aware that when you use magic, you are creating consequences somewhere in another state of existence, and you've got no way of knowing it. So you have to use magic sparingly so that you're not causing too much damage. And so that creates all sorts of moral dilemmas. And that's one of the things that I enjoy about it as well. Because the lead character, Patsy, in the early books, is very much someone who uses magic when she gets angry. And so she has to learn about the wisdom of being aware that there are consequences to acting through anger.
The magic in my books, it's not really magic. It comes from a connection with the land. So it's more of an earthy, I'm very big on the shamanic sort of themes and drawing on the power of the earth, and I've got nature spirits and the wind brothers and water spirits. And so when the kids are interacting with those forces, that's when magic happens. But I've had to think about how that would work and what would be the limits of the powers and how this fits into their reality. And there's a lot of crossing into alternate realms, and so I've had to think about how to make that a little bit more original, because lots of people have done that in fantasy novels. Playing with those ideas is really
I'm intrigued too with where you grew up in this school with only 6 or 7 kids and very rural. How did that affect how you consumed books or made up stories? Was it time to yourself to
Oh
know
yeah,
these
well
things?
surprisingly, because we were so far from anywhere, we were classified as a disadvantaged school, and that meant we got funding for things like libraries, which was funny because there were only 6 kids. So we had this amazing library with all these fantastic books, and I just devoured it. I was one of those bookish kids that read everything. And I think part of it was that I would then, because I was the oldest kid at the school, I would then run all the games, so I had to have stuff to draw on, So we would have all these magical games that often came out of various books. Yeah, so I did do a lot of that.
Now, there's a great term I've been writing, which is kill your darlings. What's your process in, you've finished a draft or a couple of drafts and you go, you know what, these things aren't relevant, but I love them. How do you go about killing them, axing them?
I cry. That's where beta readers are incredibly important, in my opinion, and of course an editor if you're working with enough of a budget to have a properly paid editor. But I've found that there's been fantastic feedback that I get from the beta readers that I use, And it's really interesting, some of the things that they bring up. Like there's one character in the second Witches book who has to climb a cliff, and he's drawing on magical powers to be able to get the strength to be able to get to the top of it because it's desperation. And a really good friend who Peter read it said, it's not physically possible for him to do that. A man of his age and stature, it is not physically possible. And I said, but he's drawing on magic. And she said, even with magic, not physically possible. So I accepted her opinion on that and changed it. And that was one of my darlings, because I loved the tension that it built when he was doing that. But I had to modify it, scale it back, and just accept the fact that all that wonderful stuff that was, had to be gone. So, and you've just got to do that. But when you go back and read the draft after you've killed one of your darlings, invariably it becomes a situation where you go, I'm so glad that I did that. And so sometimes that'll mean almost the whole chapter gets thrown out. But if it's going to make it a better story, it's worth doing it, yeah.
I think working with an editor is a very good training ground for killing your darlings, because editors are very professional and they're very, very ruthless. And so the first time I had an experience with an editor, I took my massive Emerald Child manuscript. I'd been hiding away and shown it to Soul, and I went to the Writers' Festival down in Sydney, and there was a panel where you could go and show an editor your work. And I showed up to this HarperCollins editor, and he took one look at my book and he said, well, you'll have to cut 20,000 words out of it for starters. And I walked away going, oh my God, how do I do that? It's perfect. And I think you realise very quickly it's not perfect, and you're going to have to go over it. So that's the tightest book ever written, that first book, because I went back, I was so shell-shocked. I bought a stack of writing books on how to edit your own work, and I went back to the drawing table and just edited it to death, and then sent it. It actually went through two different editors. One of them had a PhD in children's literature, and the other one was an editor for the Australian Poetry Journal. So that's something you definitely need to do if you're going to self-publish your books, is have some real editors, not just family. I've learned.
And it's also worth being aware that, as Stephen King says in his book on writing, you've got to accept that it's going to be at least 10 to 15% of your first draft gets thrown out, at least. And if it's not 10 to 15%, then you need to look at it again, essentially.
Let's talk about this self-publishing now and editor. Getting editors, what are some of the tools that people should look at if they're writing and wanting to self-publish? What are some tips or pitfalls to avoid?
I found my editors, what is it called, Australian Society of Editors, or it's a professional body that you can approach. And I mean, editors cost money, so you have to be prepared for that. My husband's a lawyer, used to be a lawyer, and is very, very pedantic. So he's more brutal than most, so I actually get him to edit it first, so at least it's been looked at. And then I send it off to the professional editor. Tips? I'd say Ingram Spark is number one tip. If you want somebody to do a good job publishing a book.
We're chatting with him later today, with you, which would be great.
They just make it easy. There's a few, self-publishing is such a big thing now, indie publishing, it's a whole scene. If you want to make money out of it, then there's a lot of courses about doing Amazon ads and Facebook ads and publishing online. And Mark Dawson has a course called Publishing 101. He's an Englishman who's very popular. I think if I had done a course like that at the beginning, it might have made it easier. It was a steep learning curve. You have to know how to lay out the book yourself, and you have to get someone to design the cover. You want probably some professional to do that, because that's what sells the books. So you've got to see yourself as a business, basically. I've got a company, it's all set up as a publishing company.
I think that's an important side with any part of indie life, is you've got your creative side, but you must have that, you don't have a publishing house that's going to have an army of people to do all that and charge accordingly.
The marketing, I think that's the biggest thing. You have to know something about marketing, or at least do your best to find out about it.
And it's very handy when you happen to work in advertising as well.
Yeah, sure.
And have the capacity to design their own covers. So I'm in the very fortunate position where I can actually act very much as a one-stop shop. So once I've written it, I've spent years working in InDesign, so I just throw it into InDesign, get it all laid out, and the cover design doesn't take me a great deal of time. So I managed to save so much of the cost by having that background that people like Karen have to take on. But the thing of using Ingram Smart is amazing just how much it saves you in terms of money. And it also distributes your book globally around the world. What you need to realise is that if you try and do it through Amazon and get global distribution, what Amazon actually does is they use Ingram Spark's distribution.
I think Ingram Spark's better quality.
It's much better quality. And it's also, you can get hardcover with Ingram Spark, which you can't get with Amazon, but the quality difference is huge.
But Amazon is good if you want to publish ebooks, and certainly if you want to make your fortune, you write romance novels or thrillers, and you churn them out. This is true, isn't it? And you have to put them on Amazon and play the Amazon ad game, and BookBub is another thing. There's a whole industry there, but there are people making millions of dollars. Like there's money there.
Self-publishing and building your buyer list, isn't it? You basically, if you can have a list of enough fans, then you've got a self-sustaining business, right?
So you need to have books to sell afterwards. If you want to make that move into a business.
And live appearances are very important as well. And I've also got an early childhood initiative called Storytime Lane that I've done in conjunction with a woman called Emily Smith, where we have children's picture books, and I also sell my Witches of the Crossworlds books through it. And we do live shows in libraries and so forth, and it's amazing how every time we do one of those live shows, we sell so many books. Everyone who turns up will buy a book. And the beauty with that is you're not having to go through the thing of some of the money going in consignment to the bookshop. So the turnover that you get from that is just amazing. So if you do a library show, you get paid a couple of $100 by the library for doing the show, but you might get $300 in book sales.
The other market with kids' books obviously is schools, and that's a huge market. So I go around, I do talks in schools, you get the whole school shows up, and then you get people buying all the books for the parents buying their books for the kids. School libraries buy the books. So if you're known in, and that again is an industry, you go and join the Children's Book Council, you show up at the meetings, you get to know a bit of teacher librarians. I've travelled to various book librarian fairs. There's one in Newcastle, there's one I went to recently in Dubbo, and you just have a stand and you meet people and they buy their books for you for their schools. So yeah, there's various ways. Actually, the other thing I found with kids' books was old age homes. Lots of grandmas want to buy the books for their kids. So I went through, before Christmas, I got invited randomly into all of these old age homes because someone's grandma had heard about me. And so I just gave them a bit of a talk about the books, and the next minute I had all these people buying books for Christmas, which was great. You've got to think outside the box a little bit.
You do, don't you? You have to go in all different directions and find what works for you and what works. We were going to wait for questions at the end, but if people want to ask me, if something sparks an idea, sorry I should have said this earlier, feel free to just stick your hand up and we'll ask for questions while we go. Yeah, it's a lovely group, you're wonderful. When self-publishing, what are some of the other essentials, whether it's beta readers or other editors? Do you ever do different samples of your cover to see what resonates more with people?
We probably should, but all of those things people to organise.
Yeah, and because of my professional background, I just tend to have a very strong idea of what I want to do. So working within advertising, it'll typically be, you'll do 3 versions of a logo for a client, but if I'm doing something on my own project, I know exactly what I want and I just go straight to it. So
I've actually been having long conversations with the booksellers around the place about, because they're the ones who know what's going to sell. And so I found them really helpful talking about covers, because when your books are in a bookshop, there's more competition. You've got people who are big names. They call the Random House people. The Random House is the star maker. So they get all this marketing budget behind them, and they've got certain types of book covers. So you can learn from what they're doing. You can certainly learn from the booksellers.
And it's amazing how some little details can make a really huge difference. Like, one of the things that looks really nice presentation-wise with the Witches books is taking the druid symbol that I've got on the front cover and making sure that at the start of every chapter, it's just there, small and discreet. And it puts just that little spark of magic into the layout of the book. So making sure the layout looks clean and slick and has a touch of magic within it in itself is really important as well. And the other thing is, what is far harder than writing the book, I find, but so incredibly important, is getting the back blurb right. And I agonise on that. Yeah. And that's where I rely on feedback from other people probably more than in the book itself. And quite often I'll get something drafted by someone who has read the book and use that as a guide for what to write, because someone else's perception of it gives you such a good idea of what really stands out for other people.
Well, I think they teach whole courses on that in the Masters of Literature, how to write book blurbs.
Yeah.
They do, there's assignments.
Synopsis.
Yeah.
Well, they're kind of the two things, aren't they? There's the cover and the back blurb are essentially what people are going to buy.
But the thing that I found that's the most important is probably getting reviews from people, and especially if you put the reviews on the cover. Because I found when I published The Shaman's Secret, I got a review in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it was unbelievable. I thought, wow, I've made it. And it actually sold so many books. Just having it, well, there was a photo of that book cover in a featured article with a George R.R. Martin book, wrote Game of Thrones. And I thought, and my book wasn't even published, it was just an e-book at that stage, but I'd sent it off to a reviewer at the Canberra Times, and she'd sent it to Colin Steele, who was a really well-known fantasy reviewer. He was a professor who published and everything, and he liked it, and he put it in this review, and then, so it was in all the newspapers, and then it was also in the Best of the Year Science Fiction magazine. And having that review and being able to put that in on the back of the cover and everywhere, I just plastering it on my website was a really good way to sell books. Yeah.
Placement's an interesting one too. The thing of you saying how your review was next to a review on George R.R. Martin's book.
It's always good.
It's a big thing, and I was absolutely thrilled when The Witches went on the shelves at Harry Hartog's, because happy coincidence, Davidson, Dahl, they ended up next to each other. So I had my books next to Roald Dahl's books, and I thought, oh yeah.
It's great, isn't it? Is there an art form, given people buying books electronically are looking at a little version of your cover, so is there an art form in redesigning covers to be appealing this big?
I think there is. I've seen lots of big publishers doing that. They put out a whole different set of covers for the e-books.
Yeah.
I haven't done that with mine, but only because I'm not an artist and I need to find someone to do the e-book covers. But I think crisper, because they're so small, you're right, they're so small. So I think in an ideal world you'd have a paperback cover and then you have...
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons why I've kept the Witches covers so simple. So they do work both as a very small thumbnail and work quite big, so that there's that instant recognition, so that they may not look as detailed as some heavily worked covers, but I really like that thing of having something very simple that is easy to read, that in a glance you can take it in, whether it's large or small or whatever.
Now you both create fantasy worlds, fiction. Do you do this because ultimately you want to be God?
I love playing God in books, and as you would know from conversations that we've had in the past, I enjoy inventing religions just for fun. So when that whole thing of creating gods and letting them behave as real mischiefs and stuff like that, and really every time I have a godlike character in a story, they never behave in a nice way. It's funny that I just love making gods be horrible villains.
I think I'm actually the opposite. I'm searching for some kind of meaning when I'm writing, and it's sort of my connection. So I'm not really being God, I'm just looking for some input there. I'm doing a PhD at the moment looking at re-enchanting the world through speculative fiction. So using these themes to tap into something deeper, something that's more meaningful. And I find that in my writing. So, no, I'm not very good at playing God, actually.
Do you feel, on this subject, you need to put a moral message in your stories?
Definitely not.
No?
No, that was the first thing when I went along to lots of writing from publishers, particularly. They said that in a lot of old-fashioned books, you know, you've got all these morals and you've got the message at the end. Kids don't want that anymore. They don't want you to tell them how to think. And I find that when I'm working with kids, you know, they've got really strong ideas, generally really good ideas. So they just want to read a story that's, you know, something they can really get their teeth into without being told this is good, this is bad.
And if you start putting a moral into it, then you're interfering with the characters being able to drive the stories. I'm a great believer in the importance of let the character drive the story. Don't get in the way of the character. Just sit back and watch them, because they will develop if you just let them have the freedom. And they do become the drivers of the story, and they surprise you as they reveal their personality. And if you try and put a moral into it, then you are forcing behaviours on them. And I find that every time I try to force a behaviour onto one of my characters, they rebel and they fight back. And I realise that it's just a waste of time. Let them do their thing.
I think ideas definitely come through, you know, through the characters, but not necessarily moral.
Villains, we all love good villains. What do you do to make villains superbly bad?
I think it's usually that the villains are motivated by self-interest. But that's what I always find, particularly with the godlike ones. My godlike characters, it's always about their ego and their megalomania. And that's not something that I try and impose on them. It's just something that the characters reveal as it comes out.
I find that if a villain has a connection with the main character, particularly if one of my villains is the mother of one of the main characters, there's a bit of punch there,
Yeah.
you know, so that brings up all sorts of moral issues. So, but that just happened by accident, really. I actually didn't plan for this person to be the villain, and she just ended up being a really horrible villain. So, but I think having a motivation, well, hers is for your ego, there's lots of reasons for her being the way she is. So making a villain human, I think is good. Although there are some villains like Voldemort who are just completely bad, Iago in Shakespeare's play. But not so. I think you really need to have some humanity in the villain to make them more disturbing.
And it is really interesting too, because you have that concept of good people do bad things and bad people do good things. So, for example, Hunter, the central figure in the second Witches book, it wasn't until I was halfway through the book that I was starting to get a handle on whether she was a good person doing bad things or a bad person doing good things. And it turned out that she was really, really horrible, a lot worse than I originally dreamed she would be. But that was really ambiguous for the first half of the book.
Yeah, it is quite fun when they do become really bad, and you can have them throwing the fridge off the building and things like that.
Yeah. That's correct. Just going back to a technical side of YA, the publishing industry seems to have quite strong views on word counts. But when you self-publish, it's not necessarily something you have to abide by, or is it? And what are the approximate word counts?
I think you still follow the guidelines because it's useful. I think 40,000 words for a kid's book works pretty well, but 40 to 60 I find works.
I work to about 70,000 typically well, the first Witches one is 37 and the second one is 80,000. But I find from the point of view of telling the story, around about 70 is where I feel comfortable. And I think it should also be pointed out that in that YA space, one of the reasons it's such a restricted model that the major publishers work to in this country is because it's a very small market in this country. And that's one of the main reasons why it is so beneficial to look at the self-publishing path for middle grade or for YA in Australia, because the size of the market, it's very difficult to get picked up by major publishers, and you have so much more freedom to let your characters be what you want them to be if you follow that publishing partner.
Is there anything else? Well, just want to talk about printed books versus e-books. Is there a percentage you noticing in your own sales, one way or the other?
I think in the kids' market, paperbacks definitely sell better.
Yeah,
Parents
absolutely.
want to buy paperbacks for their kids. I think, again, if you're writing thrillers or romance books, e-books might be the way to go.
But I actually want the kids to buy paperbacks too, so while the Witches books are available as e-books, I don't push the e-books, I really push the paperbacks because I'm a great believer that it's healthier for kids to be reading real physical books. So that's what I try and push, and a large part of the reason why I'm doing this is it's motivated by the thing that drives the Storytime Lane initiative of wanting kids to be reading.
Yeah, at the same time, I think if you can get them reading anyway, sometimes kids, if they've got an iPad in front of them, they're happier to read and they won't pick up a book. I know with my youngest, I'm having this problem at the moment. So in that case, if there's e-books available, get them.
Yeah, that'd happen.
Get them reading anyway you possibly can.
There is something wonderfully tactile
There
rather
is.
than that's the joy of the book. This is a question I always ask. Are you a book sniffer? Do you love the smell of books? I'm a book sniffer.
Of course,
So I'm
you
coming out of the
don't
closet.
become a writer unless you're a book sniffer.
Yeah, and it's so funny that you ask that because that's one of the things every time a shipment of books arrives.
Yes.
You open the books and you go,
You open the books and you're
so you breathe it in and then you take a photograph and post it saying, yes, another box of books.
Yeah, I think it's the nostalgia too, because when you're a kid, you smell the older books.
Yes.
It's lovely to have your own.
I was passing a bookstore in Melbourne a few weeks ago and it was like McDonald's, how they have the smell of their food gushing out. There was this smell of sandalwood coming out and it was like, oh my God, there's fresh books, there's fresh books. Yeah, it was wonderful. They know what they're doing, right? Any questions we can open the floor up to if anyone has questions.
Do you ever try your books in front of real kids before you send them off to an editor?
Yeah, I tried my first two books. I actually went into Linear School, the Steiner School up the road here, because I'm local, I live just here. And I read the whole book, the whole of The Shaman's Secret, over a number of weeks to the kids, and that was the best feedback I could possibly have had. So,
Did you change anything?
Yeah, I did actually, because the thing that it showed me most was where the story needed to go faster, where they were nodding off. So the pacing of the story. I think definitely give it to people who can, to read it for you. Maybe not before the editor. I think I'll probably have it all, because it was early stages for me. I was just trying to get all the feedback I possibly could at that stage. But I think now I would have it all edited, ready to go, then get your beta readers, read it to kids if you possibly could, and then go back and make the changes that you need to make. Re-edit it again if you need to.
My most brutal critic by a country mile is my daughter. She tears my books apart, so I'm actually scared to get her to read them. But she's also like that with my artwork, and she happens to be very talented both as an artist and a writer herself, so I do respect what she's got to say. But it's a similar sort of thing of waiting until the later stages to pass it on to people with children to get them to read it. And I'm very much a believer that I don't want kids to read it until I've had feedback from adults where the adults say, I really enjoyed that book. It's got to be something that an adult will enjoy for a child to be able to enjoy it, because if an adult goes, well, it's an interesting story, but it's too much of a kid's book, I didn't really get into it, then I don't think a kid's going to enjoy it either. And I think you've got to write for children as you would for a grown-up, but keeping it age appropriate. And I found that by taking that approach, when it does get read by children in the target age group, they always seem to enjoy it. And I've got a good friend who's also a client who had a 12-year-old daughter who she could not get to read. It didn't matter what she put in front of her, she couldn't read it. And the best feedback I've ever had was when I gave her a copy of the first Witches book, and she started sending me these MMS messages that were photographs of her daughter sitting at the breakfast table with her face in the book, sitting in the back of the car going to school with her face in the book. And she got in touch with me a couple of weeks later and said she'd finished the book and is now keen to read other books. So that's the best bit of feedback I've ever had, that someone has gone from being a non-reader to a prolific reader because they found a book that was interesting for them.
What about reading yourself? Oh, sorry, what was the question?
I've got a question. I've written a series mainly with tactical characters. I've got a tactical background myself, and I find that it's not the best place to approach schools if you've written tactical stories. So or just that's my assumption that, you know, guns and tactics generally don't go well with school kids and teachers and parents. How would you get beta readers for that? Like for that kind of audience?
I guess beta readers you could still get.
You can approach anybody, really.
Join writers groups. Writers groups. Writers groups are the most fundamental basic that you need to be writing, and it's when you get into writers groups, and I like to be in more than one writers group, and you end up developing strong relationships with some of those people where you'll better read each other's works. And you will be amazed how, after a few years in a writers group, you look at what you were writing before you joined the writers group, and you almost feel embarrassed by what you were writing before you start to get that really valuable feedback. And it really helps you to find your voice in a very clear and articulate way.
You can also find groups like that through Facebook. I mean, as terrible as Facebook is, but you can find an online community, and lots of people will read each other's work through online communities.
Yeah, and there's also groups like, down the back of the room we have Georgie Donahoe from Creative Kids Tales, and that's another wonderful place where you can network as well. So it's well worthwhile having a look at the website and looking into the sorts of people who are writing there and trying to develop connections.
Joining the Writers' Centre, that's useful. I used to go down to Sydney Writers' Centre, the one he's with.
Yeah, I'm part of that and part of the Hunters Writers' Centre.
Yeah.
I had an issue where I work away, so nearly every time I join a writers group, I can go to 1 month out of 3. So, like, you generally don't get that bond with other writers.
So are you Maitland based?
Yeah.
And there is a Maitland Library Writers Group that I facilitate that meets on the first Thursday of every month.
Yep.
And if you're a member of Hunter Writers already, then you're welcome to join it. And we meet from 4 p.m. until 7 p.m. first Thursday every month. So next Thursday will be our next meeting. So please come along and join us.
I go back to work on Monday.
Right. But you know what? Even if you can't turn up until 5:30, and you can only be there for the last hour and a half or so of the meeting, it's still worth coming along and joining in.
Any other?
I was just interested in doing a PhD and writing stories. It's quite a change of gear to go from one to the other. And I was wondering how you straddle those two worlds.
I have to say it's actually a nightmare. I don't know if I recommend it. Because it's, writing the thesis, you're in your academic brain and you're all very logical, and it is a very specific way of writing. And once you get your head around that, you've got to just put that all to one side and write your creative work in a totally different space. And then somehow the two have to merge and become research. So it's not what I thought it would be. I thought it would be this wonderful experience of writing a novel, but actually it's research training. So I think it would be easier to do a straight critical PhD, but I love writing, and that's why I wanted to do it. And I'm certainly, the whole reason I'm doing it is I'm working with people who are wonderful. David Musgrave, the poet, he's been fantastic. So to get access to those sort of people, to speak about what you're interested in at conferences and things. I'm going over to London hopefully in June to speak at a creative writing conference. So, it does give you all those opportunities, but you have to be aware that it's not easy at all. It's a very disjointed process.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, thanks for the introduction, Graham. The Creative Kids Towers Writers Group is online, and you can come and go to suit yourself. We do have a roster system where it's more structured, if that's what you want to do, but you can do it from the comfort of your own home.
Okay.
Over the space of a week, you've got to critique someone else's story, and they've got a week to do yours as well.
When you're creating your magical world, do you make up the whole rules and restrictions yourself, or do you do some sort of research to go along with it? And how do you feel when people turn around and go, no, that's not how it works?
And I say to them, well, it is how it would happen because it's my world, I created it.
It's my world.
So,
It's my world.
but I've got such a clear picture of how the rules are, and as I was saying before, I do base them loosely on physics, and I just sort of change a couple of the laws of physics to suit myself, and it all fits within that. So there is a lot of consistency to it, but what's really good fun is the villains that come from other worlds that have other laws of physics, and that's where you can get really creative, and it's just sort of creating it on the fly, but it's just making sure there's consistency with the approach that you take to it, and you'd be amazed just how broad the scope can be. And if people want to criticise it as that magic doesn't make sense, then that's their problem.
Yeah, I think if you keep it consistent, you don't get much criticism. If it works, within the world you've created, then if it's not going to work in the real world, it's not going to matter. They don't pick you up on that generally if you make it believable.
Consistency is what you're talking about there,
definitely.
staying consistent, yeah. Apparently The Wizard of Oz, when it was translated into Russian, an engineer translated it, and he changed the Tin Man to Iron Man because tin doesn't rust.
And now it's
So he just went, Tin Man can't be rusted because he's made of tin. He's Iron Man now in the Russian version. So there you go. So I was going to ask just about, or did I ask this about reading? How much do you read and digest books? Yeah, as part of your
Because I'm doing a PhD now, I read non-stop and it's killing me. But because I'm doing a PhD in speculative fiction, I read all the stuff that I love reading, and I'm finding all this wonderful mystical fantasy stuff to read, and all of that is feeding into the work that I'm doing. I think when you're writing, you just have to read all the time. You're just constantly reading because it just opens up your world. Even when you're looking at things like narrative structure and how to make the novel work, you read all sorts of different genres. David Mansfield got me reading The Sound of the Fury by William Faulkner, which if you read is very literary and very different narrative points of view, because that's one way of telling a story, and he wants me to open my mind up to all these different possibilities. So I think the more you read, the better of a writer you are.
And the broader the range of genres that you read too.
Yeah.
I tend to get into the habit of, when I'm writing fantasy, I'm not reading fantasy, I'm tending to read memoirs or sometimes fairly dry stuff or historical fiction, and I find that by reading stuff that is a very, very different genre to what I'm writing, it keeps what I'm writing fresh rather than it becoming something that is significantly influenced by other books from the same genre.
I quite like reading the similar when I'm writing, just because I'm immersed in it then.
Yeah, and that's very much the case too. It's different writers have different approaches, and I love reading fantasy, but when I'm writing it, I'd much rather read something else so that I'm getting my head into a different space. So, yeah.
Any other questions? We've got about 5 minutes left, I think. Any others?
How much research do you have to do into deeper matters, so that you're not just in fantasy, la-di-da-di-da,
Goes deeper and deeper.
Yeah, this is one that we talk about a lot in the speculative fiction group that I'm in down in Newcastle. And the general rule of thumb is keeping the research very minimal during the first draft, because if you do a lot of research when you're doing the first draft, you'll find that a lot of it ends up being research into subjects that you end up not using much of. So you keep it very light for the first draft, and then you look at the areas where you really need to drill down a bit more, and you do your research before the second draft. So, for example, it was after the first draft of The Witches that I realised the house is very much like Tokal Homestead. So after having done the first draft, I went out to Tokal Homestead, took lots and lots of photographs, talked to people about the history, researched its history, went on to historical websites to find out what happened with a dead body in a country house in those days, when it was a dead body that occurred late at night and it was going to have to be kept overnight in the house. And tragically, it turns out that it would be wrapped in wet blankets and kept in the larder because that was the coolest place, so it was kept next to the fresh food. It's before the second draft that you really need to do all your research.
I think you do bits of research when you're writing the first draft. Definitely you sort of do a fair bit of reading around certain themes, probably. But by the time you get to the second draft, you know what you have to look at. So when I wrote The Shaman's Secret, I hadn't really even thought about the shamanic side of things, but once those themes were coming through the book, I actually went and worked with a Native American shaman for months and had various experiences which I then was able to write about in the book, which I wouldn't have been able to if I'd just read about them. So I think some of your research has to actually include real life research, definitely.
Fantastic. Can you remember what it was like when you got your first box of your first book and you opened up that box? What was the sensory feeling like? What was it?
One of the happiest moments of my life. Simple as that.
Yeah, my father is a very practical farmer, and he said to me, well, first of all, he couldn't work out why on earth I'd be a lawyer. He said, stay on the farm, Karen. And then I said, well, Dad, I'm going to write a book. And he said, you know, getting a book published is like winning the lottery. It's never going to happen. And so I always had at the back of my mind that getting a book published was an impossible thing. You know, you can write, it's never going to be published. So when I had my box of books sitting in front of me and I sent a few off to him and said, read this, Dad. It was a very magical moment. I thought anything is possible. I can do anything.
When you're characterising your characters, what do you look at traits of people you know? Do you have a little checklist of characterisations to make sure people look consistent?
They're almost always loosely based on people that I know, and it might even be someone that has served me at the supermarket a few times, and you know particular characteristics about them. But it's really good to have someone who is actually existing that you can sort of fall back to, and that's another one of the tips that you'll find in Stephen King's On Writing book, and I think it's a very valid one. It doesn't mean that they take on the same personality as that person, but it just gives you a little bit of an anchor so that you can keep yourself going back to something that is consistent. But when you completely build a character from the ground up, it takes quite a while to really develop them to the point where you can keep them consistent if they're not based on someone that you know.
And there are certain personality types, so it's useful to think of people you know who are a bit like that character. I take a lot of inspiration from my poor children, who'd be horrified to hear me say this, but I've got 4 kids and they range from age 21 down to 13. So, and they've all very different personalities. So knowing them, knowing their friends when you're writing sort of that age group, that younger age group, has been very, very useful. I hope they don't have too many issues about it later on.
Do they recognise themselves in the books?
Well, I think I changed them enough so they don't. I mean, it's not them.
Yeah.
If they read it closely, they might see some. My daughter, my 21-year-old, is still upset with me because in my 3rd book I've got these wonderful water spirit dementor characters who are horribly creepy and feed on the sadness of the children. And that was completely her idea. And I was talking to her about what sort of villain am I putting in this book, and she's going, what about this? And they've got dripping hair and la 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 la. And I just stole the whole thing.
And a lovely little story I've got is there's an early reader book that I've got in the bookshop called Rise of the Shadow People, and that's based on a story that I ad-libbed for my kids when they were little. And whenever I read to them at night, after I'd finished reading a passage from a book, they'd say, Dad, can you do a little bit more of the Chickamauga story? So I'll just make it up ad-lib. And it ended up developing into such a full-on story that a couple of years later I thought, I'm going to write it down as a book. And when I did that, they pleaded with me, Dad, just promise us, if ever you put it into print, will you change our names, please?
Yeah, you can't put your actual kids in the books. I do know a fellow who put his whole family in a fiction novel and their actual names, and they're not actually speaking to him anymore. So you've got to be a little bit careful.
That's fantastic. We've hit our hour. If there's any other last questions or anything anybody would like to ask or anything, and if not, just we'll put our hands together for Karen and Graham. Their books are available in the bookshop as well, and I'm sure they'll sign them if you hunt them down as well. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.